We're going to get started. Just preface this with, saying that many of us who are, somewhat liberal-minded or moderate politically have concerns about the, reestablishment of the Netanyahu government and the hard right turn it's poised to make. Our concerns conflict with our deep love and commitment to the state of Israel and leave us in a state of flux, frankly. We certainly need guidance and greater understanding of Israel's political landscape, and we're very fortunate to have a guest this morning who might be able to guide us along that path. We are honored to have Neri Zilber, a policy advisor at Israel Policy Forum, and he's going to make a presentation to our congregation. He is a regular contributor to the Daily Beast, the Foreign Policy, the Globe, and Mail, and Financial Times. He's a policy advisor to the Israel Policy Forum, and everybody had received his full bio in advance, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but we are very grateful that Neri is going to speak to us this morning. At the conclusion of his comments, we are going to open things up for Q&A. And I ask that you don't just wave in front of the screen, but that you actually go into the lower part of your screen where it says reactions and click on raise hand, and I will call on people and you'll be able to unmute and ask your questions at that time. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to Neri Zilber for his address to us this morning. Thank you so much for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kendra Simon, for that kind introduction, and good morning to all of you, I assume in Chicago. Good evening from Tel Aviv, which is where I'm based. Thank you for having me on to talk about a topic that I know is near and dear to all of our hearts, which is Israeli politics and the situation coming out of last month's election. And now what we're looking at is the new Netanyahu government, and like you said, far-right government. So Netanyahu, along with various ultra-Orthodox and far-right parties that are going to make up the new Israeli governing coalition, I think in just a matter of weeks, so perhaps a week or two more for the coalition negotiations to run their course, but it will be happening. So we have to look at it with clear eyes and try to make sense of it, which is what I endeavor to do this morning. The plan for the talk, I'll give a presentation for about 20 minutes. And then I'll, part of the first part of the presentation will be actually the good news. I was tasked with providing some level of optimism, some ray of hope. So I'm actually going to do the reverse. I'm going to start with the more positive news, and then I'll shift to the more negative news, the bad news, and to get into what this new government is, what its makeup is, and what it plans to do. And has a lot of far-reaching plans on its agenda. And then I'll open it up for Q&A, which from my experience is always the best part. So I'll start with the good news. And if it's not good news, then maybe more positive news. And if it's not more positive news, then maybe less bad news. We'll put it that way. The election last month, obviously Netanyahu and his right-wing allies secured a clear majority, 64 seats out of 120 seats in the Knesset. But the deeper story, and where I take some solace, is the fact that out of the 4 million plus votes total that were cast on November 1st here in Israel, the majority of those votes went against Netanyahu by about 30,000 votes. So very slim margins, which we expected. But it's clear when you calculate and add up all the votes, which I did after the election, that the anti-Netanyahu bloc, which is very kind of broadly defined, but it was still a very clear anti-Netanyahu bloc, won more seats than the pro-Netanyahu bloc. So Netanyahu and his various ultra-Orthodox and far-right allies by to the tune of 30,000 votes. So when we talk about Israel and Israel's rightward shift and Israeli demographics, which is often discussed, it's important to keep in mind that a slight majority still did not want to see what may be coming down the pike. So that's just in terms of the overall Israeli electorate, right? In a political sense, too, there was a very specific context, the political context to what happened on November 1st. I won't get into it in my presentation. I can answer it in the Q&A, but it's very clear to my mind that there were certain things done and not done by the now outgoing government. So basically the anti-Netanyahu bloc that really could have maybe changed the result. And if the result was different, then we'd be having a very different conversation about, the state of Israel and Israel's future and so on and so forth. I'll add to that also the Israeli media over the election campaign, and it was quite a long election campaign before November 1st. They also played a role, and now they're playing a slightly different role, which again, I won't get into now, but we can get into in the Q&A. So again, it's important to keep in mind that there was a very specific political context to the result we saw on November 1st, and that gave this mandate to Netanyahu and his right-wing allies. Third thing I'll say in terms of good news, since November 1st, and since it became clear that what the agenda of this new Netanyahu government would be, that poll after poll taken by various organizations and media organizations show a clear majority against a lot of these either policy items or specific ministers in specific ministries. Take just one example, they're planning on kind of changing the powers that the Supreme Court has, and I'll get into that in a second. There's a very clear majority against that in the Israeli public. There's a very clear majority against, say, getting rid of the grandchild clause, in terms of who is a Jew and who is not a Jew. So they may be planning on getting rid of that in terms of who is eligible to make aliyah, to immigrate to Israel. So those are just two examples, but poll after poll do show the majority of Israelis are against what this new government is planning. So it's something to work with. It won't change the fact that Netanyahu will be the next prime minister along with a specific government. But in terms of how you think about Israel, and really how I think about Israel too, it is a ray of light. It is a ray of light. And like I said, if there was a specific political context which brought this specific government to power, then surely that specific political context can be changed moving forward to hopefully give rise to a different kind of Israeli government. And Israel, after all, is a democratic system. So that is my hope. That is my good news right off the bat. I'll get to the bad news, and this is a longer list and a longer conversation, because I too am quite concerned about what this government is planning. I said this before the election, over the summer in my own work, covering the campaign and just really looking at what Netanyahu and his Likud party members and his various allies on the Israeli right were saying that they were going to do if they won the election. And taken all together, I think there is a real danger for Israel's future as a genuine liberal democracy. And I don't say that lightly, but I said this before the election, and now, sadly, I'm likely going to be proven correct. It is existential. It is existential, and we need to understand the stakes in order to, basically kind of psychologically process it, and also understand what role each of us can play as this new government unfolds and as it really begins governing. So what do I mean by in terms of existential stakes or changing Israel's character from a genuine liberal democracy to something else? I'll start with the makeup of the government. That's been very much in the news in recent weeks. Specific ministers getting specific ministries. I'll just rattle through a few of the hot button individuals that are of greatest concern. So obviously there's this individual called Itamar Ben-Gvir, who is a disciple of the Rabbi Meir Kahane. So he's a genuine Kahanist. He was a fringe figure for a long time in Israeli politics, but this time, in alliance with other far-right factions, really amplified his political power and has now leveraged that into an agreement with Bibi Netanyahu to allow Itamar Ben-Gvir to be the minister in charge of the Israel police. So this is an individual who himself has been convicted for racist incitement against Arabs here in Israel, and now he will be responsible for the Israel police. And not only that, they're planning on passing a law, maybe even before this government is seated, to expand Ben-Gvir's power over the police. So basically to dictate policy. And he's been very clear about that. He wants to dictate policy, how the police function, what they do, and also what they do not do. So that's a real area of concern, not only internally and domestically in Israel, vis-a-vis, I would argue, primarily the Arab Israeli minority, but also in Jerusalem and East Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, which is under the purview security-wise of the Israel police. So that will be Itamar Ben-Gvir's turf. And also in the West Bank, Netanyahu gave Ben-Gvir control over the Israel border police forces that work in the West Bank. Historically, these forces, which are part of the Israel police, but they were under the control of the Israeli military, the IDF, when they were deployed in the West Bank. Netanyahu, in the agreement that he signed with Ben-Gvir, gave Ben-Gvir control over those border police forces, which are responsible for things like riot control and demonstrations vis-a-vis the Palestinian civilian population in the West Bank. They're also oftentimes responsible for at least curtailing the excesses of the settler hilltop youth, which is Ben-Gvir's strong base of support. So you can imagine a situation where those border police forces under Ben-Gvir's control will not do that. The second individual of gravest concern is Bezalel Smotrich, also a far-right pro-settler politician. He, in his negotiations with Netanyahu, managed to obtain not just the finance ministry, which is a very important portfolio here in Israel that can impact basically the entire functioning of the government in the country, but also Smotrich was able to obtain a deputy minister post in the defense ministry. So basically Smotrich or someone from Smotrich's party will have control over basically all of civilian life in the West Bank, which will remain under the defense ministry, but will now be beholden to this civilian deputy minister, either Smotrich himself or someone, like I said, from Smotrich's party. I can't overstate the change that this might herald in terms of what is allowed and what is not allowed in terms of settlement construction in the West Bank. That's really what Smotrich is going after. He wants to be the minister responsible for the West Bank through this deputy minister portfolio. And there are various IDF organs, military organs that historically have played this role, and Smotrich was able to receive control over those military organs. So you can expect a lot of unchecked settlement construction, which is near and dear to Smotrich's heart, and also non-housing or building construction for Palestinians. So he's likely going to go after those Palestinian buildings and homes in the areas of the West Bank that Israel controls, which again historically has been under the purview of the Israeli military. So really a sea change in terms of Israel's policies in the West Bank. The third individual, which again very much in the news in recent weeks, a guy by the name of Avi Maoz, again a fringe character nobody had ever really heard of before this recent election. He's a far-right politician, a religious extremist. His claim to fame, if I can use that term, is his anti-LGBTQ and anti-women policies. So he very much ran on that agenda. I think he people say he had about 30,000 supporters, 30,000 votes that he was able to muster. But again, he was running in this kind of far right alliance, and so he now is a member of Knesset with one seat, and he was able to leverage that one seat with Bibi Netanyahu to obtain a deputy minister portfolio in the prime minister's office. I'll spare you the details, but the top line is that he does have some control over education curricula in secular Israeli schools. There's been a big outcry here in Israel about this far-right individual, kind of beyond the pale, perhaps inserting very draconian and very extremist curricula into the education system, and also maybe taking certain things out of the education system. That's in terms of Avi Maoz. And then the fourth thing, and this is kind of a whole of government, whole of the coalition agenda item, they're really planning on going after the Israeli judicial system, whether it's the Supreme Court or the Attorney General here, or the various legal advisors that operate in every ministry. They are planning a wholesale reform agenda for the Israeli judicial system, and that will be spearheaded likely by a Likud justice minister. But really, it's wall-to-wall kind of support for this overhaul of Israel's judicial system. It's important to stress in terms of kind of areas of concern. So it's not just individuals implementing their policies, but it's kind of, as I alluded to, wider than that. There's something called the override clause that they want to push through vis-a-vis the Supreme Court here in Israel. The Supreme Court, it's kind of the court of last appeals here in Israel under the Israeli judicial system. So there's no constitution, right? There's no second and higher chamber of parliament like the US Senate. There's no president with veto power. The president here is a symbolic post. So really the last resort for anybody trying to appeal either a Knesset decision or a government decision or any kind of, say, conviction in court was the Supreme Court. Remains for now the Supreme Court. And what this incoming government wants to do is pass a law that says, okay, the Supreme Court can strike down a law that we pass. Say they pass a law, not next week, but next month, banning left-wing NGOs. They say, they're anti-Israel, they get foreign funding, whatever the pretext is. They ban all left-wing NGOs here in Israel. Historically, those NGOs could appeal this law to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court more than likely would overturn that law, would strike it down. With this override clause, the government can now override the Supreme Court decision and push through a law like that. And that's just one example. They can wake up tomorrow, again, not tomorrow, next month, when they finally take power, and outlaw the Palestinian flag, right? So anybody raising a Palestinian flag, criminal offense, send them to jail. Historically, that could be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, on issues of kind of civil rights and minority rights, more than likely would strike it down. Why are they going after the Supreme Court? Every kind of element in this incoming government has various reasons. So the settlers historically didn't like the Supreme Court striking down certain settlement construction in certain areas deemed private Palestinian land in the West Bank. So in my own work, and I've been doing this for quite some time, a decade plus ago, they were very, very angry at the Supreme Court for precisely that reason, for not allowing them to build on what they deemed or was legally deemed private Palestinian land. And so they ordered the settlers via the government to demolish those structures. So that was kind of the genesis of the anger towards the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli right deems it an activist branch of the judiciary, even though the numbers and also just the policies that the Israeli Supreme Court has enacted historically, not as progressive, let's say, as people imagine. Really, oftentimes has towed the Israeli government line. But again, they want to build unchecked in the West Bank. Bibi Netanyahu obviously is no fan of the Israeli judiciary these days because of his ongoing corruption trial. So whether it's the Supreme Court or the position of Attorney General, which is the highest lawmaking official in Israel, so it's kind of combination between what in the U.S. is the Attorney General and then a White House counsel. So in Israel, that person, now a woman, wears both hats. So they want to kind of diminish her power and the power of that position, and so on and so forth. The ultra-Orthodox want to get rid of judicial oversight because they want to strike down Supreme Court decisions, basically dictating that ultra-Orthodox boys have to go serve in the army. They want to kind of get rid of that, and the list goes on. So to my mind, when we talk about this being kind of existential in terms of Israel's future as a liberal democracy, it really starts and I want to say ends, but it doesn't end there. But it really starts with the Supreme Court and the Israeli judiciary. It could devolve into a situation where a simple kind of absolute majority in the Knesset, 61 seats, can basically do whatever they want unchecked. Majoritarian rule. And that's no longer a fantasy here in Israel and is of great concern. The second area of concern, as I alluded to, was the West Bank. If the powers that Netanyahu gave Mr. Smotrich are fully enacted, there's no other real way to say it. It's effectively de facto annexation or operational annexation of the West Bank. So basically what prior to this government was under the purview of the Israeli military, then it's now going to be shifted almost wholesale to civilian control. And that's de facto annexation. The other aspect of the West Bank, which has been a high priority for people like Itamar Ben-Gvir specifically, is the rules of engagement for the Israeli military in the West Bank. So Ben-Gvir ran on a campaign that he wants to loosen the rules for opening fire on, he says against everybody, but really it's against Palestinians in the West Bank that are throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails or engaged in militant activity, terror attacks, and so on and so forth. There are clear rules of engagement for the Israeli military operating in the West Bank, and he wants to further loosen those rules of engagement. Now, that is historically under the purview of the Israeli Chief of Staff, who is a supreme actual commander of the IDF. But even in the past week or two, there have been very public spats between Ben-Gvir and the IDF general staff with regards to these types of issues. And this is even before Ben-Gvir and this new government takes power. So you can imagine it likely getting worse after they take power. Third area of concern, and really it's almost kind of, if you go down the list, these are very important Israeli institutions that they are now either planning to quote unquote reform or overhaul or meddle with. So if it's the judiciary and then the kind of Israeli military control and authority in the West Bank, the third area of concern is the Israel police. The Israel police, for the reasons that I mentioned, in terms of Ben-Gvir having direct control over what they do and again, what they don't do. And you can imagine a situation where internally inside Israel, that Ben-Gvir shifts a lot of the focus and resources and just operational activities of the Israel police, say vis-a-vis Arab Israelis, right? Or Bedouin in the southern Negev, and maybe away from things that were historically under the purview of the Israel police, i.e. settler violence and terrorism in the West Bank. So again, just a thought experiment. The fourth issue, education system. Really, Avi Maoz, the individual that I mentioned earlier, that led to a real outcry amongst the Israeli public. So if it wasn't kind of settlement construction in the West Bank or kind of very complicated issues like the power of the Supreme Court and the minutia of the Israeli judicial system, Avi Maoz and the specter of him meddling with the education of secular Israeli children did lead to a major outcry. And I think that's both important to understand and also telling in terms of what may shift the Israeli public consciousness. Finally, issues of synagogue and state, which I know is of real concern to diaspora Jewry and American Jews. They're planning, I'm still skeptical whether they'll actually push through these plans, but the ultra-Orthodox are planning perhaps to amend, excuse me, not just the grandchild clause, i.e. who was eligible to make Aliyah or not. Historically, it was, you just had to have one grandparent that was Jewish, and that was enough. And I think that is enough. But they want to kind of maybe perhaps get rid of that, and also perhaps to stop recognizing reform and conservative conversions. So again, these are things that are being debated. I should stress that on issues like synagogue and state, both here in Israel and with respect to diaspora Jewry, and also, by the way, LGBTQ rights. So there's concern that, say, the new government will cancel the gay pride parade in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem. I'm a lot more skeptical whether these agenda items will actually be pushed through, because Netanyahu knows, I think he knows, speculating that he knows, that this will be a bridge too far. This will be a bridge too far, both domestically inside Israel and vis-a-vis the Jewish world. And that he'll, at a certain point, stop it from actually coming to fruition. But again, if only a fraction of what I just listed comes into effect, that's more than enough to shift Israeli, I guess, not only policy, not only society, but the actual reality here on the ground. I'll just conclude by saying that, well, I'm very pessimistic with regard to the upcoming period. I think that whether in the West Bank or Jerusalem or even internally inside Israel, things may get a bit rocky. So you can kind of imagine a scenario where they push through these reforms with regard to the Supreme Court, or say, the education system or something of that effect, and the opposition, which they've already kind of started doing, or soon to be opposition, takes to the streets. You could have kind of major demonstrations where half the country is really protesting against what the government is doing. You may also see a situation where senior civil servants and what they call here in Israel gatekeepers begin resigning en masse. So it could be the police commissioner, whose authority has been curtailed by Ben-Gvir. It could be Supreme Court justices. It could be senior Israeli military officers who don't agree with what the government is doing in the West Bank. I think that's a real scenario that we have to take into account. I'll conclude with one final point. The real question that everybody is asking is, where is Netanyahu in all this? Whether he's allowing this to all happen because he's so weak and he needs these political partners in order to quash the corruption trial against him, whether he himself believes that, okay, I gave all these things to my coalition partners, but really at the end of the day, I'm still the prime minister, a very experienced prime minister, and I can control what will happen. I can kind of contain the fallout. I think that's slightly optimistic. Or whether the third scenario is whether Netanyahu actually believes in all these reforms, whether Netanyahu himself has fundamentally changed from the politician and leader that we knew over the past 20, 25 years. But again, I'll really conclude by saying that they haven't even taken power yet. So we all of us here and everyone looking on from outside of Israel need to kind of wait and see what happens when they finally do take power and start governing. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Hi, it's Howard Schickler. I've listened to podcasts on Israeli politics recently. Just this week, there was one in Haaretz, and what the demographer there was saying was that if you didn't split the Knesset seats by pro-Netanyahu and anti-Netanyahu, but you actually did it more in terms of how many right-wing seats she said there were. She said that the number on the right wing was closer to 74 because in the anti-Netanyahu crowd were a bunch of right-wing people who couldn't deal with Netanyahu and join his coalition. Uh, Similarly, either an IPF podcast or maybe Donnie Hartman's. The suggestion was that the population votes kind of the way their parents do, and that because of that, and because the right wing is basically out populating the rest of the population, that the rightward shift would continue. And I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Thank you, Howard, for those great questions. I will say that the best Israel-focused podcast is the one that I host. I'm obviously unbiased in terms of that. It's called Israel Policy Pod, and it's hosted by well, I host it, but it's part of Israel Policy Forum's program. So it's we try to come out every week or a few times a month on these types of issues specifically, and I try to bring on the best guests. So feel free to subscribe. Look, I hear these arguments a lot, and there's a lot to it in terms of Israel's demographic shift. I'll say a couple things. Number one, it is true that if you divide this Knesset and previous recent Knesset by right-left, that there is a clear majority, a clear overwhelming majority for the Israeli right. I would argue that there are different types of right wing, and we're seeing that play out right now. That historically, and even likely according to the Haaretz analysts, that it's really based on the Palestinian issue, right? Are you for a two-state solution? Are you not for a two-state solution? And that's kind of the left-right divide. My argument is, in terms of that, is that that's fair, that's reasonable, but that's not what the recent elections were about. That's not what Israelis went to vote on. It was not, I would say, even the first or second or third order issue that Israelis were preoccupied about, and I say that with regret, but it wasn't. So if there was a real referendum in terms of Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians, we may see a different result. That's number one. Number two, like I said, there are right wingers and there are right wingers. We have to remember that Ariel Sharon, former defense minister, former prime minister, was the staunchest right winger there was for decades. And he was the one who in 2005 dismantled all the settlements in the Gaza Strip and got rid of and disengaged Israel from the Gaza Strip. So again, if you are a right winger with a more secular mindset, like Ariel Sharon and a lot of these right wingers in the anti-Netanyahu camp are very staunch right wingers. I'm not going to say they're not, but they're also predominantly secular. And there's a big difference, from my experience, between secular right wingers and people like Smotrich and like Ben Gvir, who think that all authority and all answers come from above. And I spent a lot of time in my work in the settlement, and those are very different conversations. So again, if push came to shove, I think the makeup of the Knesset would be different if it was a pure election strictly on the Palestinian issue, but that's not what this was about. And again, we have to be very kind of realistic and clear-eyed about where we are right now in terms of Israeli politics. It was important enough for the anti-Netanyahu camp to win, to precisely avoid the scenario we're seeing now. The fact that they lost is the reason why we're in the mess right now with a real far right government in place. And by the way, Howard, in terms of demographics, yes, I live in Tel Aviv, and demographics here in this city, you have a couple, if you're lucky, you have a couple with a dog. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. And if you go to ultra-Orthodox cities like Bnei Brak or settlements, as far as the eye can see, all you see is children. They have, 6 kids, 7 kids, 8 kids, 9 kids to a family. And Israeli secular families actually a very high birth rate relative to other kind of advanced Western countries. But they'll have 2, 3, maybe 4. So yes, the demographics are a real thing. But like I said at the top, despite the demographics, a majority of Israelis voted against the government that we're seeing right now.
Thank you, Neri. I ask people after they have asked the question if you would lower your hand so that I'll know that I don't need to call on you again. Daniel, you're up.
Again, thank you, Neri, for coming here. It's one thing to read about all this. It's another thing to hear someone who's on the ground talking about it, and it's even more sobering than what I've been thinking. I have a more go forward, optimistic possible question I'll save for later, because what I can't get out of my head is the last 2 things that you said, which is the discussions, and it might be too far now, but the way things are going, it seems, to end the grandchild clause. So you can't make Aliyah unless you are, I'm assuming your mother is Jewish, and the ending reform and conservative conversions, which I understood to be conversions in Israel, not outside of it, but still, if this is what they're talking about now, and they haven't even started yet, and the progression continues, what is it hyperbolic to worry that someday there will be no right of return unless you're Orthodox? Is that even crossed anybody's minds? I mean, look, in context, having grown up thinking that no matter what happens post-Holocaust, at least we can always go back to Israel, is what we were told as kids. And you see the outbreaks of anti-Semitism in this country and how the president can flip no matter the conditions in the country. After what we've been over for the last 2 years, it could still be a coin flip that you have a fascist in the White House again. So my question is that even something to consider worrying about?
Look, the fact that they're raising it and they talk about this openly, and again, it's the ultra-Orthodox parties, it's also certain elements of the far-right parties, should be concerning. I think, frankly, it's beyond the pale. I'm still very skeptical that it will actually come to pass. So in terms of that bullet, we'll hopefully dodge it because of the severe implications it could have, both here in Israel and in terms of Israel's relationship with really the entire Jewish world. And again, Netanyahu knows that. But yes, I would be concerned. Look, I probably should have said this in my presentation, so I'll say it now just to put it out there. I think American Jews specifically, and also all diaspora Jews, have a role to play now. They have a role to play. You can't, I'd argue you shouldn't kind of turn your back on Israel and say, okay, it's a lost cause. I would argue the exact opposite. I would argue the exact opposite because of your relationship with Israel and your support for Israel and your love for Israel. Your concern and you speaking out about these issues. Again, not you, Daniel, the all American Jewry, all world Jewry, should speak out and should have your voices heard. Because while Israelis don't like to be lectured to by outsiders, it does seep in. It does seep in, and there are elements here, political and civil and religious, who very much need that support. And American Jewry, and by the way, also Washington and the administration, need to be very clear with the incoming Israeli government that there will be repercussions. There will be repercussions. Again, it's not for me to say, I'm a journalist, what those repercussions will be, but there are certain red lines that should not be crossed because after all, both America writ large and American Jewry like to emphasize the shared values with Israel. Israeli government, with the Israeli state, with the Israeli society, and the people here in Israel need to both appreciate that and uphold those values.
I'm going to call on Barbara or Mitch in a second, but on that whole subject of Israelis not liking to be lectured by outsiders, what has been the general international reaction to the reestablishment of the government under Netanyahu?
Wait and see. Wait and see. And it's not an unreasonable position to take, because, like I said, everyone's kind of waiting to see how the government shakes out and what they actually do once they take power. So like all of us, they're looking on. I'll choose my words carefully. I think the U.S. administration, the Biden administration primarily, but not only, there are also close friends of Israel in Europe and other parts of the world that need to make very clear to Netanyahu himself that certain things will not be tolerated. Will not be tolerated. But again, it's not for me specifically to say what will happen if those lines are crossed. But that message needs to be relayed to Netanyahu himself. And again, it's not only the issue, right, of this specific Israeli government doing X, Y, or Z in terms of policy. It's also overall the message that it sends to the Israeli voting public, because after all, this is a democracy where, yes, you can go and vote for an individual like Itamar Ben-Gvir, right, because you want more law and order on the streets of Beersheba in Israel's south, and you might be a secular Israeli, not even really that right wing, but you like his message in terms of law and order, and he's promising all these things in terms of reinstituting security, right? But in the back of your mind, moving forward, you need to know that people like Ben-Gvir and others in Netanyahu's camp will will really harm Israel's standing internationally, not as an abstract concept, but in terms of real, tangible implications for the average Israeli citizen. Because otherwise, they'll just keep voting for right-wingers because there's no real cost to that vote. That in their mind, the West Bank and the Palestinians are over the hills and far away, and nobody really cares about them anyway, because that's what Bibi told us. Nobody really cares about this issue anyway, not the Arabs, not the Europe, not the West, not America. Again, I'm speaking in terms of just the regular average Israeli voter. So again, it's not just the Israeli government, it's also the Israeli public that needs to be shifted.
Thank you. Now for the Sirota of choice.
Sirota choice. Hi, Mitch Sirota here. I think that the Israeli election, the electorate were voting for stability overall. I think that's what they saw as the most important issue in front of them, because they've had so many governments in such a very short time. They knew that if, okay, let's give Bibi a real chance this time, he'll take it, and we won't have to have an election next week. That being said, you're scaring me, Neri, which is probably what you wanted to do. And it sounds that there are two things going on in Israel. The one, irony of ironies, Israel is turning into a fascist government, which is just unfathomable. But worse than that is the way these policies seem to be shaping up. We're going to have an intifada, the likes of which Israel hasn't seen yet. If they clamp down, the way you're saying that the people who are going to be in charge of police instead of military, if they clamp down the way you're suggesting they do, it's going to be absolutely horrific, the uprising we're going to see. And that is scary, not only for Israel, but for us in the United States. What's our policy going to be in that regard? We are really caught, between A, our love for Israel, and B, the insanity that they're trying to perpetrate upon us and the rest of the world and the Palestinians, to say nothing of what's going on with the diplomacy with the Arabs, that they're finally coming to their senses that, yeah, maybe we should deal with Israel. And now they're going to say, maybe not.
Right. those are all great points. And look, I share your concerns. Number one, you're absolutely right. A lot of the voters, especially the ones that voted for Likud, so I guess, in terms of the dog's breakfast that is the Netanyahu, the pro-Netanyahu coalition, Likud was the left-wing flank of this coalition. I know people close to me personally who held their nose and voted for Bibi Netanyahu because they didn't want another election.
Mhm.
And like this person who very close to me, there are thousands of others, and that's the people you really need to shift. And I could see that shifting in future. In terms of fascist government and intifada, yes, I share your concerns. I share your concerns, especially for two reasons, right? Number one, if they really get rid of the Supreme Court's kind of oversight role, then they're free to do whatever they want and justify it in terms of just, well, the majority rules, and we got a mandate from the people. Who are you to say? Who are you to go against the democratic will of the Israeli public? But again, that's not the full extent of what a real democracy really is. And then number two, in terms of just the stability on the ground, yes, I as somebody who focuses a great deal on the Palestinian issue and the conflict, I agree. It could get very rocky in the West Bank, in Jerusalem. Intifada, yes or no? That's a huge question. Nobody has an answer to, not even the professionals in the Israeli intelligence services. I will just say that Intifada requires real organization and leadership on the Palestinian side, which is uncertain for right now. Doesn't mean it might not grow up organically, or maybe even top down if the leadership changes. But yes, I share your concern in terms of just overall stability, and in terms of where you as American Jews find yourselves. I'm very sympathetic. I'm very sympathetic as somebody who in my own work as both a journalist and an analyst tries to be objective, right, and call it like I see it in terms of Israel, but also obviously I'm very close to Israel and love on a very personal and deep level the idea of Israel as Zionist homeland, the Jewish homeland for the Jewish people, because of the great need spanning millennia. It's very difficult to explain. It's very difficult to explain that Israel as such is a real positive and a beacon of light in terms of the history of the Jewish people, and also, by the way, in terms of just its contribution to the world. And yet, there is a really, really difficult political dynamic at play, whether vis-a-vis the Palestinians, whether what we're seeing now grow up from inside Israeli society. And all I can say is that that contradiction, that dichotomy, I think is closest to the truth as I see it, as I believe it to be true, but also it's very difficult to explain. But we need to kind of explain that we may be very adamantly opposed to Israeli government policies on specific issues, adamantly opposed, but the overall concept of a Jewish state in this part of the world is still very much worth fighting for, despite the rocky period that we're going to likely be entering.
Thank you. Vera.
Hi. Hi, Neri. Thank you for a very concise presentation of what's going on in Israel now. I have a couple of questions, comments. One is about how long should West, including United States, try to revive the two-state solution? We're trying again and again and again and hope for different results, which is kind of stupid. And I talked to several Palestinians that I worked with, and none of them wants two-state solution. They want one-state solution. So that's another thing. One other thing about Netanyahu, I listened to a lecture from, I can't remember his name, but a very good lecturer from Hartman Institute. I think it was a couple years ago, and he was talking about annexation of West Bank. And he was saying about Netanyahu that he's a very pragmatic guy, meaning that, you know, half of Israel is for annexation, half of Israel against annexation, and he is maintaining kind of, he doesn't disagree with either one, and he doesn't do anything. He talks about annexation, but he doesn't do anything. And this is his pragmatic side, which I hope will prevent and all other unfortunate development in Israeli government. Another one is why we never talk about the other side, like Abbas administration or whatever you want to call it. They prosecute LGBT people. They prosecute people who revolt against their policies. They prosecute, they give money to terrorists who kill Israelis. They give them a stipend, and we continue to give this money, fully aware that this is what the money is used for. So where do we stand here on? Another thing, and why don't we call Abbas and Hamas administrations the fascist administrations? It's only Israel that can be called such an absolutely terrible names, okay? We had ourselves here in this country had an almost fascist administration just 2 years ago, and nobody left, okay, that I know of. We are continue to live in this country, support this country, fight for the right things to do. And if we get along with everybody else in the world against Israel, that's the end of us, not just Israel. Can you comment on any of this? I don't know if it's like questions, but I want to know your opinions on this stuff.
Thanks, Vera. So I'll say a couple of things, likely in reverse order. Look, we obviously hold Israel to a higher standard, and we should. Israel, I don't want to use the cliches, light unto the nation, right? That's a very, very high bar. But when you talk to Israelis, especially, security professionals or politicians, and they'll say, well, why don't you as a foreign journalist care so much about Syria or the abuses in Iran or even in the Palestinian Authority or Hamas? Like, first of all, journalists do care, but that's not the standard that I'd like to hold Israel to, and not the standard that Israel demands that people see it as, right? The only democracy in the Middle East, part of the Western liberal democratic order. So again, I would rather not compare the Israeli government to Hamas. Now, in terms of Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, yes, you can go back and look at what I've written. I've been, very critical of them as well, but also given them credit where credit is due. And I will say, I wrote a whole book about the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas's security forces. And it's about 30,000 men under arms working in the West Bank in cooperation and coordination with the Israeli military and the Israeli intelligence services on a daily basis to uphold stability and to stop terrorism. So again, in terms of the Palestinian Authority, I'm not a huge defender of that regime, and it really is an authoritarian regime. But it's a mixed bag, or let's say it's more nuanced than people popularly imagine. In terms of Bibi being a pragmatist, yes, that was true in the past. Like I said in my remarks, it's an open question whether it's the same old Bibi. The old Bibi, I heard it firsthand during my own work a decade ago, and Israeli judges and legal experts said he was the biggest defender of the Israeli judicial system in the past. He wouldn't let his right-wing allies touch the Supreme Court. And now we're obviously seeing quite the opposite. So in terms of where Bibi Netanyahu is at the moment, it remains to be seen whether he's still a pragmatist. And in terms of the one-state solution, yes, it's a huge threat to Israel's future as both a democracy and a majority Jewish state. So both characteristics that are, I would argue, very near and dear to Israel's fundamental character, a Jewish democracy, are in threat. Are in threat because of the lack of, you can call it whatever you want, but a separation into two political entities between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And like your friends, the Palestinian friends rightly say, at a certain point, the Palestinians will wake up in the morning and say, look, this process has been going on now for 30 years in terms of a peace process or two-state solution, division of the land. We're not really into that anymore. We just want one state and we want equal rights, including equal voting rights. And you'll have a majority of Arabs/Palestinians between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and that will be a very, very different type of challenge. So again, in terms of the two-state solution and being kind of pessimistic about its prospects, yes, I share that, but there is no other real viable alternative short of separation, to my mind.
Okay, we're going to try to, no, Vera, wait. We have 5 minutes left, actually fewer than that, and I've got three more people who have questions. So I would like to give them a quick opportunity to ask some concise questions, and we're going to move on to Tikva at this stage, then Neil, and actually I thought Henry and Flo had their hand up too, which I'm glad to entertain their last question. So Tikva, please. You need to unmute, please. Thank you.
It's a comment and a question. I'm worried about the power of the army, that it's going to be weakened. I hear lots of comments of people that they don't want to send their children to the army anymore. I heard last night that Ben Gvir wants to change the law of the every 3 years for Miluim to be 2 years or 1 year to be involved in Kravi, where the Miluim has the option only for 3 years. And the other thing, what happened a year and a half ago, that the more we are strict in Israel, the Arab citizen in Israel are going to have a riot like they had about a year and a half ago. And what do you think about that?
Should we do the other question and then I'll take both of them?
That would be fine. Neil?
Okay, a very brief comment and then a question about something you said before. There's been discussion before about the government policies giving rise to an intifada or something of that nature. I'm afraid there's nothing that Ben Gvir would like more, because it would give the justification for the most extreme clamping down and anti-Israel Arab action that he would like to take. Like your comment on that. And my question is this: earlier, if I understood you correctly, you said that, you know, if things got to such an extreme, the Israeli population would realize that there would be really tangible, real consequences to them, to their daily living from doing that. And I thought that was in good measure because of the reaction of the United States and the rest of the world. what specifically did you mean? Because I did not understand what those consequences could or would be.
Sure.
Okay. There's one other screen. Let me just see if they had a question too, and then you can
Okay.
put them all together. Henry and Flo, did you have a question that you wanted to ask as well? You're passing.
My hand down.
All right, fine. You got it all now.
Okay. Thank you, both Neil and Tikva. I'll start with Neil, and then I'll switch to Tikva. In terms of consequences, like I said, I'm more of a journalist, so it's not really my place to give kind of policy recommendations. But I'll float a trial balloon. Hypothetically, if before the election, a Biden administration official had said, "Look, we're really keen on pushing through this visa waiver program to have Israelis have visa-free travel into the U.S." Right? But we don't know if Public Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir and all these other individuals really will be the right interlocutors and the right people who share our values in order to really get this done and put it over the line. You could imagine, for the average Israeli, a visa-free travel to the U.S. is really important, really important. That has a tangible impact on their daily lives, as opposed to, say, more abstract concepts like construction of settlements in the northern West Bank, yay or nay. So again, that's just a kind of a hypothetical, but really it's not for me to say. It just, in terms of that comment, I would say that both from American Jewry and the Biden administration and diaspora Jewry writ large, that you have to make your voices heard and make it very clear to both the Israeli government and the Israeli public that there are kind of real red lines that you would not like them to cross. In terms of an uprising and violence and instability here serving Ben-Gvir and the other far-righters' interests, yes, 100%. 100%, and they're perhaps banking on that. And there's no consensus issue that brings the Israeli public together like Arab violence. And this is likely if not the goal for Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, then perhaps they don't really mind. They won't mind that much if things go up in flames, with the caveat that Netanyahu himself will very much mind, because it could erode a lot of the mainstream kind of center-right support that he has. He is taking he's taking great pride in the fact that he's kept things stable and hasn't gotten Israel engaged in military adventures both here and abroad, unlike his predecessors. But yes, in terms of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, it may very well serve their interests. Tikva, yes, there's a great concern in Israel about this new government meddling with the Israeli military, with the IDF, with chain of command, with the rules of engagement, and so on and so forth. In terms of Israeli parents sending their kids to serve in the army, yes, it's a great concern, not only in terms of the army itself per se, but just in terms of giving back to the country. A big slice, an overwhelming slice of the Israeli public who serves in the army, who pays taxes, who works, who really is the backbone of the state, socially and economically, may not be big fans of this government and are asking themselves real questions about, okay, do I send my child to go into a combat unit that will be implementing Smotrich's policies in the West Bank? And yes, it's a huge question, and this is a big part of the incipient, fermenting public outcry that we see now. And outgoing Prime Minister Yair Lapid put it well the other day. He said, we're not your suckers, we're not your frayerim, for those who know that term. We don't just serve in the army and pay taxes, and do your bidding, and then have you kind of meddle with our kids' education or with our ability to shop and travel on the Sabbath. So yes, it's a major concern, but again, with the caveat that we have to wait and see what this government actually does. And then the final point about Arab rioting. So Tikva was alluding to the May 2021 riots that came in the context of the escalation with Hamas in Gaza. The Arab rioting is slightly misunderstood. It wasn't a response or in solidarity with the war in Gaza. It actually had a lot more to do with what was happening in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and then in and around kind of various East Jerusalem neighborhoods. So you can imagine a scenario where Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, is back in the news because it's under the purview of a true believer like Itamar Ben-Gvir, and then other kind of policy shifts vis-a-vis East Jerusalem. But yes, that's also a concern. That's also a concern. Yes, you know, I hate to end on this very kind of negative note, but we have to be clear-eyed about what may be happening and who we're dealing with. And you know, hopefully I'm proven very wrong. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I think the coming year will be a bit rocky. But again, you know, the Israeli government is the Israeli government. Israeli society is, like I tried to highlight, something different. And then the overall idea of Israel as a state and as a refuge and a homeland for the Jewish people should be something else entirely. And we all have to kind of keep all those three things in mind as we move forward, and not lose sight of the fact that that governments can be elected, like this one has, in a democratic process, and they can also be elected out of office as well.
Neri, thank you very much. You know, you've told us a lot. Frankly, I wish that in your opening comments, when you gave us the good news, that it lasted longer than the bad news that you shared with us. But, you know, we needed the reality check, and we appreciate your candor. And hopefully, if we are graced with your presence again to give us a story, then maybe it'll have a more positive spin to it. But you've been very gracious with your time, above and beyond what we originally asked for. And thank you so much. For the rest of you, we can continue talking at current events on Thursday, and you know, you'll be able to vent a little bit more. Vera, I'm sorry I cut you off. You know I love you. I didn't do that on purpose. So, Neri, thank you so much.
Thank you all.
And,
Take care.
Be well, everybody. Take
See you
care.
all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.